The chief reason that the southern colonies were settled was to make England money through the growth of cash crops, such as tobacco and cotton. That's not to say, however, that religion didn't factor. Because southern immigrants weren't fleeing religious tyranny, they brought England religion with them, Anglicanism. On the surface, Anglicans and Catholics were very similar. Sacraments such as baptism, communion and taking the Eucharist, and confirmation, that is, to become a member of the church, were shared central beliefs. Both sects of Christianity, that is, Catholics and Anglicans, had a similarly organized leadership structure in their church. The chief difference between the two at this time was that Anglican services were in English, at least in England they were, and Catholic services were in Latin. Anglican churches also allowed for divorce, whereas Catholics did not. Religiously speaking, this meant that southern colonies had a closer cultural tie to England than the north, a key difference early between the two parts of East America. For wealthy Southerners, church services were as important a social function as they were a religious one. Because of how spread out and separated plantations were, church services were frequently one of the few times the community came together. The wealthy, naturally, would want their wealth and prestige seen and acknowledged. Through making large donations to their church, wealthier members would have their own pews located closer to the front of the congregation, the perfect place to be noticed by everyone when making a conspicuously late entrance to a church service. Anglican churches focused more on the ritual of religion, as opposed to a continual quest for spiritual purity in the land of the living. A belief system that would therefore enable the morally problematic practice of slavery and all the evils that went with it to continue and thrive with little questioning or examination up through the Civil War. The First Great Awakening. There were two religious periods in America that would have profound impacts upon our nation's early history. Known as Great Awakenings, these periods were times of profound religious conversion, religious revolution, and community shaping and altering landmarks. The First Great Awakening, which began in England and emigrated to America, reached its height between the 1730s and 1740s, just a few short decades prior to American independence. The ideas of the First Great Awakening directly challenged the notion of predestination, the idea that since God is all-knowing and all-seeing, each person's salvation was already predestined, that is, predetermined before they were even born. Therefore, life on earth, under predestination, was more or less about going through the motions of leading a good life, awaiting death in the hope that heaven was predestined for you. Your actions on earth, however, could do nothing to alter your predestined course in the afterlife. George Whitefield was the British minister who rose to challenge this notion. His fiery, passionate sermons, first in England, then in America, would draw thousands upon thousands of listeners each time he talked. And this was in a time before there were microphones or amplifiers to make his voice heard by all. Crowds would be so large that only fields outdoors offered enough room to hear Whitefield speak. Whitefield directly rejected the Puritan idea of predestination. He preached that mankind's fate was precariously hanging between heaven and hell. God held each and every soul dangling by a mere spiderweb over the very pit of hell. Whitefield would whip up crowds into such a state of panic over the notion that their souls were in mortal danger of damnation, that open weeping, even fainting, was common among both his male and female followers. He would encourage his listeners, however, and here's where the break with the Puritans and those who believed in predestination occurred, that each and every man and woman had the power within themselves to attain salvation and therefore entrance into heaven by forming a close and personal, individual relationship and understanding of God, through their own effort, through their own work, and through their own study. What was so revolutionary about this is that the power of salvation was put into individuals' hands. One's spiritual future was one's own, not one's ministers, not one's families, or even one's genders or one's status as a slave. This not only empowered average, even working-class poor around the American colonies, it inspired and empowered women to take up study of the Bible and even leadership roles within the Christian community. Slaves were also empowered with taking command of their spiritual lives. It was not uncommon for slaves and slave owners to attend such religious revival meetings together, to pray together, to weep over their salvation and love for God together. One of the wealthiest slave owners in all of America, Robert Carter III, was so moved by his spiritual conversion that he freed all 500 plus of his slaves during his lifetime, more than anybody ever freed before the Civil War. This ultimately condemned himself to die in relative poverty, as well as ostracized from both his family and fellow Southerners who didn't share his religious zeal. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were admirers of Whitefield's preaching, especially how it promoted individual effort and work to attain salvation. Franklin would reprint many of Whitefield's sermons in his many newspapers all over the American colonies. The First Great Awakening linked spirituality with individualism, a very American value and trait. If one's efforts and works could determine the fate of one's soul, why couldn't they determine one's station and success in the earthly realm? This is a question Washington posed quite frequently throughout his entire life. The First Great Awakening would encourage the very early American characteristic that one's deeds could and should determine the worth of a person, both in the afterlife as well as the present life. Further out of the First Great Awakening would grow new, uniquely American forms of Christianity. Baptists and Methodists both grew out of rebellion against the older, more European forms of Christianity, such as the Puritans and the Anglicans. At first persecuted, then thanks to the First Amendment to the Constitution and religious liberties granted within states, these religious sects of Christianity emphasized the importance of developing a spiritual connection, a connection that was felt with God as opposed to solely attaining that relationship through studying the Bible in an academic sense. This created a great deal of interest in learning and reading about the Bible and learning and reading about God, which quickly became the most commonly printed and sold book in the colonies. Literacy rates skyrocketed amongst the free people of the colonies, with nearly 100% literacy among everyone except the slaves by 1776. A more literate population meant that more people were also reading the ideas of liberty and individual rights, such as those by John Locke and Thomas Paine, just prior to the Revolutionary War. In America, freedom to form a relationship with God was as important as having the freedom from oppression from your government. The First Great Awakening inspired rebellion against traditional practices of Christianity and traditional notions that your birth, not your ability, should determine the rank you could attain.